Keep your dowry, Audrey Bellamy said, and before anyone in the chapel could draw a breath, she tore the veil from her hair and let it fall at Warren Prescott's feet. The white lace settled across the gray stone like surrender, but Audrey's lifted chin made the truth unmistakable. She was not surrendering. Wind pressed against the stained glass windows of St. Orizon, making the candle flames tremble along the altar rail, while nearly 200 guests sat frozen beneath the vaulted ceiling. Only moments earlier, the chapel had glowed with expectation. Now every jeweled head had turned toward the bride who had halted her own wedding before the vows could be spoken. Warren stood beside her in a black mourning coat, handsome, composed, and pale with fury. "Audrey," he murmured, his smile never reaching his eyes. "Pick it up." She looked down at the paper hidden inside her bouquet. The ink was still fresh. A secret amendment to the marriage settlement. Bellamy Glasshouse Farm would pass to the Prescott family the instant the ceremony ended. Her younger sister, June, would be removed from Blackwater Reach and placed under Margaret Prescott's guardianship. Even the small cottage where the widows of the fishing village dried herbs for winter medicine had been listed among the assets to be transferred. Audrey's fingers tightened around the page until it crackled. "You said the farm would remain mine?" Warren's voice dropped lower. "I said what was necessary to bring you here." A murmur moved through the pews, soft as rain against glass. Audrey searched the front row for her father. Silas Bellamy sat rigid beside June, his weathered hands clasped so tightly that the knuckles had gone white. He would not meet Audrey's eyes. That silence wounded more deeply than Warren's deception. "Father," she said. Silas stared at the stone floor. Warren leaned closer, the scent of cedar and cold air clinging to him. "Say the words. Your family has nowhere else to go." Beyond the chapel walls, the sea struck the cliffs more than 100 feet below, each wave sounding like a distant door being slammed shut. Audrey thought of the glass house her mother had built, its cracked panes glowing gold at sunrise. She thought of June carrying baskets of white camellias through the mist, of the village women whose wages depended on the winter crop, and of every quiet sacrifice that had led her to this altar. She had agreed to a loveless marriage to save them. She had not agreed to become the signature that erased them. Margaret Prescott rose from the first pew, her silver gown whispering over the floor. "This is neither the time nor the place for theatrics." Audrey turned toward her. "No, Lady Prescott. This is exactly the place." Gasps passed through the chapel. Warren reached for Audrey's arm, his expression hardening as his fingers closed around the fabric of her sleeve. "You are embarrassing both families." Before Audrey could answer, a man's voice came from the shadowed rear of the chapel. Calm. Deep. Absolute. "The lady has withdrawn her consent." Every head turned. Everett Sterling, Duke of Wexford, stepped from beneath the dark gallery, his tall figure severe against the candlelight. He had remained silent throughout the ceremony, watching with gray eyes that seemed to miss nothing. Now he walked slowly down the center aisle, and the guests parted their attention before him as fields bend beneath an approaching storm. Warren released Audrey at once. Everett stopped several feet away, close enough to intervene, far enough to leave the choice entirely hers. His gaze moved from the fallen veil to the paper trembling in Audrey's hand. "No door in this chapel will be closed against her," he said. "And no vow will be spoken unless she chooses it freely." Audrey looked at him, then at the altar, then finally at her father. Silas raised his eyes at last, and in them she saw shame, fear, and the terrible knowledge that he had known more than he had confessed. The bells above St. Orizon began to toll, though no hand had pulled the rope. Outside, the wind had set them moving. One note. Then another. Audrey stepped over her veil and turned her back on the man she had nearly married. The silence that followed Audrey through the center aisle was not the silence of mercy. It was the silence of judgment. Fans lowered. Faces sharpened. Whispers began before she had reached the chapel doors, each one soft enough to deny and cruel enough to wound. Margaret Prescott moved first, sweeping after her with the rigid grace of a woman accustomed to obedience. "You will return to the altar," she said. "You will apologize, and this disgrace will be forgotten. Audrey stopped beneath the carved stone archway. Outside, rain had begun to sweep across the churchyard in silver sheets, blurring the gravestones and the black sea beyond them. June stood near the front pew, pale and motionless, while Silas Bellamy remained seated as though age had settled upon him in a single minute. Warren stepped down from the altar. His composure had returned, but it had changed shape. It was no longer confidence. It was calculation. Audrey is overwhelmed, he told the guests. The strain of the morning has clearly affected her judgment. A murmur of approval passed through those who preferred a fragile bride to a dishonest groom. Audrey turned. My judgment is the only thing in this chapel that has not been altered without permission. The words cut cleanly through the room. Warren's mouth tightened. Margaret placed a gloved hand over her heart. After everything our family has offered yours. You offered a rescue and concealed the price. Silas rose at last. His chair scraped against the stone. Audrey, please. She looked at him, and the plea in his voice nearly broke what anger had held together. Did you know? He hesitated. That was answer enough. June drew a breath that sounded too small for the vast chapel. Audrey felt the weight of every eye, yet only her sister's mattered. She crossed the aisle and held out her hand. June took it immediately. You cannot leave, Warren said. The debt comes due tomorrow. Without this marriage, Bellamy Farm will be seized. Then it will be seized honestly. And the people who depend upon it? His question struck where he intended. Audrey saw the widows in the rear pews, women who worked beneath the cracked glass roof through bitter mornings, women whose children ate because the winter herbs still sold in 3 counties. Doubt pressed against her ribs. Everett Sterling had remained several paces behind, silent, while she chose her ground. Now he spoke. The Bellamy debt will not be collected tomorrow. Warren turned sharply. You have no authority in this matter. I hold the largest portion of the note. The chapel shifted again, not with whispers this time, but with attention. Everett's gray gaze rested on Warren. And I have found sufficient irregularities to suspend collection until the accounts are examined. Margaret's face lost color. This is outrageous. No, Everett replied. It is arithmetic. Audrey studied him. There was no triumph in his expression, no demand for gratitude. Only certainty. It unsettled her more than kindness would have. Warren descended the final step, careful to keep his voice smooth. Your Grace, this is a private family arrangement. Fraud often prefers privacy. A few guests looked away. Others leaned forward. Warren's hand closed around the folded marriage contract, but Everett did not move toward him. Instead, he looked at Audrey. Miss Bellamy, you and your sister may leave freely. My carriage is waiting. Margaret laughed without warmth. How convenient. She rejects one man and departs under the protection of another. Audrey felt the insult travel through the chapel. She lifted her chin. I am departing under my own name. Everett inclined his head, accepting the boundary without offense. Then my carriage is merely transportation. For the first time that morning, June's fingers loosened around Audrey's hand. Together they crossed the threshold. Rain darkened the stone steps, and the wind caught at Audrey's uncovered hair. Behind them, Warren called her name once softly, as though tenderness could repair what control had exposed. She did not turn. At the bottom of the steps, Everett opened the carriage door but did not touch her. Where will you take us? Audrey asked. Alderwick Priory. Why? His eyes moved toward the chapel, where Margaret stood framed by candlelight and Warren remained beside the abandoned veil. Because someone wanted you married before you had time to read what was hidden, he said. And I intend to discover why. The carriage left St. Orizon beneath a sky the color of tarnished silver, its wheels cutting through rainwater that streamed along the narrow road above the cliffs. Audrey sat beside June, one arm wrapped around her sister while the chapel disappeared behind a curtain of mist. Across from them, Everett Sterling remained still, his gloved hands resting upon the silver head of his cane, his expression unreadable in the dim interior. No one spoke for the first mile. The silence was filled by the rhythm of rain against the roof and the distant thunder of the sea below. June finally looked toward him. "Will they truly take our home?" Audrey felt her sister's fear before she heard it. Everett answered without softness, but not without care. "Not tomorrow." "And after tomorrow?" June asked. He glanced at Audrey. "That depends upon what the accounts reveal." Audrey straightened. "You knew there were irregularities before the ceremony." "I suspected them. Yet you said nothing." "Suspicion is not proof." His gaze held hers steadily. "And had I spoken too soon, Prescott would have hidden whatever he feared most." Audrey looked through the rain-streaked window. The road curved inland through fields bent flat by the wind. "So you allowed the wedding to proceed?" "I attended to observe." "You observed until I nearly gave him everything." Everett's jaw tightened, though his voice remained controlled. "I did not know about the amendment." The honesty of the answer left no easy place for her anger. She turned away. Alderwick Priory appeared near dusk, rising from a black ridge where the land narrowed toward the sea. Once a monastery, it had been transformed into a vast stone residence, though little warmth had softened its ancient severity. Arched windows watched the road like dark eyes. A square bell tower stood above the eastern wing, silent beneath the rain. Beyond it, waves struck the cliffs nearly 200 feet below, sending pale spray into the air. The carriage passed over a narrow bridge just before the tide covered the lower road. Mr. Hollis, the elderly steward, waited beneath the entrance arch with 2 lanterns and a grave expression. "Your Grace?" he said, then looked at Audrey and June without surprise. "The west rooms have been prepared." Everett inclined his head. "And Mr. Shaw?" "In the library." Audrey paused on the threshold. "You expected us." "I expected the ceremony to fail," Everett replied. "I did not know how." Inside, the priory smelled of beeswax, damp stone, and cedar smoke. The vaulted entrance hall had once been a chapel. Its saints had been removed long ago, leaving empty niches along the walls. June moved closer to Audrey as Mr. Hollis led them through a corridor lit by candles set in iron brackets. They entered a library where shelves rose to the carved ceiling and a fire burned beneath a dark marble mantel. Gideon Shaw stood beside a table covered with ledgers, receipts, and folded contracts. He was a thin man with tired eyes and ink on 2 fingers. "Miss Bellamy," he said, bowing. "I wish we had met under better circumstances." Audrey looked at the documents. "Tell me what my father has done." Gideon glanced toward Everett. Everett gave a slight nod. The lawyer opened a ledger marked with the Bellamy seal. "Over the past 18 months, 6 loans were issued in your father's name. Each was secured against the farm, the glasshouse, and the eastern meadow." Audrey's throat tightened. "For repairs to the harbor. That is what the records claim." Gideon turned the book toward her and pointed to a series of payments. "But the funds did not reach the harbor. They were transferred through 3 accounts and eventually deposited into Prescott Coastal Transport," June whispered. "Warren's company." "Yes." Audrey stared at the figures until the ink seemed to blur. "My father would never invest in Warren's business." Everett moved to the opposite side of the table. "Then either he was deceived, or his signature was used. You said the largest part of the debt belonged to you." "It does." "Why?" "Because I purchased the note 2 weeks ago." Audrey looked up sharply. Everett continued before she could accuse him. "Prescott was attempting to sell it at a loss. Men do not discard profitable debts unless they fear what those debts contain." Gideon opened another folder. Inside lay copies of Silas Bellamy's signature. The first was firm. The others were nearly perfect, yet each carried the same unnatural curve at the final letter. Audrey had seen her father sign 1,000 receipts beneath the glasshouse lanterns. She knew that hand. These signatures imitated it, but they did not belong to him. "They are false," she said. June covered her mouth. Everett watched Audrey, not the papers. "That is my belief." "Then Warren tried to marry me before anyone could examine them." "Yes." Audrey pressed both palms against the table, steadying herself against the truth. The marriage had not been a rescue. It had been a closing lock. Gideon reached for one final document. There is more. He unfolded a shipping record bearing the Prescott crest. Listed beside a midnight delivery to Bellamy Harbor was the name of the man who had authorized access to the private road. Silas Bellamy. Audrey read it twice. Then she noticed the date. It was 3 days after her father had sworn he had never met Warren Prescott alone. The fire shifted behind her, casting long shadows across the ledgers. He lied to me, she whispered. Everett's voice was quiet. Perhaps. Audrey lifted her eyes. Do not soften it. Something changed in his expression, not pity, but recognition. Grief may explain weakness, he said. It does not excuse betrayal. Outside, the tide rose over the bridge, sealing Alderwick Priory from the mainland until morning. 3 months before the chapel bells rang over Blackwater Reach, Audrey Bellamy had stood beneath the fractured roof of the glasshouse and counted the remaining panes that winter had not claimed. Morning light slipped through the cracks in pale ribbons, touching rows of rosemary, feverfew, lavender, and white camellias with a beauty the family could no longer afford. Beyond the fogged glass, the eastern meadow rolled toward the cliffs, where the sea flashed like cold metal beneath the November sky. Audrey moved between the planting tables with a ledger tucked beneath her arm, stopping whenever one of the village women needed instruction or reassurance. 12 widows worked at Bellamy Farm that season. Their husbands had been lost to illness, storms, or simple misfortune, and the wages Audrey paid were modest, but steady. She had reduced her own allowance twice to preserve them. No one knew. She preferred it that way. June entered carrying a basket of clipped camellias, her cheeks pink from the cold. Mrs. Harlow says the north furnace is failing again. Audrey looked toward the iron pipes running beneath the stone floor. Then we will move the young plants south before sunset. And the coal? June asked. Audrey closed the ledger. We will find enough. It was the answer she gave whenever there was not enough. That afternoon, Silas Bellamy returned from the harbor with rain on his coat and defeat in his eyes. A storm had damaged the western pier, tearing away nearly 60 feet of timber and leaving 2 fishing boats unable to dock. Repair estimates lay folded in his pocket like a sentence. Without the harbor, the farm could not ship dried herbs to Boston or New York. Without those sales, wages would stop before Christmas. I have spoken with Warren Prescott, Silas said beside the dining room fire. Audrey's hand stilled above the account book. Warren belonged to a family whose transport company controlled much of the northern coast. His name opened warehouses, secured credit, and silenced questions. He will finance the repairs, Silas continued. On what terms? Favorable ones. Audrey looked up. That is not an answer. Her father moved toward the window, where rain traced the glass. He has also asked permission to court you. June lowered her teacup. Audrey felt no surprise, only a slow tightening in her chest. Warren had visited the farm twice that autumn. Both times, he had praised the acreage before praising its owner. Did he offer the loan before or after he mentioned marriage? Silas did not reply. Audrey understood. In the weeks that followed, Warren arrived with flowers grown elsewhere and promises polished by repetition. He spoke of protecting Bellamy Farm, improving the harbor, and relieving Audrey of burdens unsuitable for a woman. He never asked what she wished to preserve. He asked what she owned. Yet the debts gathered like frost. Coal merchants demanded payment. Carpenters refused to begin the pier without a deposit. One by one, the village families came to Audrey with questions she could not answer. When Warren finally proposed beneath the bare pear trees, she did not think of romance. She saw June safe beneath a sound roof. She saw the furnaces burning through winter. She saw 12 women carrying wages home. The farm remains under my management, Audrey said. The glasshouse workers remain employed. June stays with me. Warren smiled. Of course. His agreement came too quickly, but desperation often disguises warnings as hope. That evening, Audrey signed the preliminary settlement, while Silas watched from the shadows near the mantel. His shoulders loosened with relief. Hers did not. Days later, Everett Sterling arrived at Bellamy Farm to inspect the damaged harbor for the county trust. He found Audrey at a table covered with ledgers, maps, and repayment schedules. She did not ask him to forgive a single dollar. She presented a 7-year plan built upon herb contracts, greenhouse expansion, and shared harbor fees. Everett read in silence until he reached the final column. "You have listed every worker's wages before your own." Audrey folded her hands. "They cannot live on promises." His gray eyes lifted to hers. "Neither can you. I require less than they do." He studied her for a long moment, as though the answer had unsettled something carefully buried. Then he closed the ledger. "Prescott has offered easier terms. Easy terms often conceal expensive truths." Everett looked toward the cracked glass roof, where winter light trembled across the white camellias. "On that point, Miss Bellamy, we agree." Neither of them knew how expensive those truths would become. Everett returned to Alderwick Priory that evening with Audrey's repayment plan folded inside his coat and a disquiet he refused to name. The rain had followed him from Bellamy Farm, tapping against the carriage windows in restless rhythms, while the white camellias remained in his thoughts with an persistence more troubling than beauty should have possessed. He had met determined women before. He had met proud women, frightened women, and women who mistook dependence for devotion. Audrey Bellamy resembled none of them. She had asked for time, not mercy. She had defended the wages of others before her own comfort. Most unsettling of all, she had looked at him without calculation. Years earlier, Everett had entered marriage believing duty could be made gentle through good intentions. His late wife, Catherine, had been elegant, intelligent, and entirely unsuited to the cold isolation of Alderwick. Their union had never been cruel, but neither had it been warm. They had spoken with courtesy, dined with restraint, and lived beside one another like two portraits hung in the same gallery. When illness took her after 4 quiet years, Everett mourned not only the woman she had been, but the life either of them had known how to build. Since then, he had trusted contracts more than promises. Contracts revealed their terms. Promises waited until hope had lowered its guard. The next morning, Mr. Hollis found him in the old monastic library before sunrise, reading the Bellamy ledgers beside a dying fire. "You have not slept, Your Grace." "I have been occupied." "With county business?" Everett looked down at Audrey's handwriting, precise even where the ink had faded. "Something less orderly." Over the following weeks, his inspections took him repeatedly to Blackwater Reach. Each visit was justified by the damaged harbor, yet he found himself lingering in the glasshouse after the measurements were complete. Audrey worked among the long planting tables in plain gray wool, her sleeves folded neatly at the wrists, her attention divided between accounts and people. She never performed kindness for an audience. That was what he noticed most. When Mrs. Harlowe's youngest son fell ill, Audrey rearranged the work schedule without announcing why. When coal ran short, she ordered the south room closed and moved the most delicate plants herself. When a shipment was delayed, she ate bread and broth with the workers rather than dine alone in the main house. Warren Prescott also visited, though his interest lay elsewhere. He walked the property with a polished cane, asking about acreage, storage capacity, and shipping rights. Once, while standing beneath the broken roof, he pointed toward the eastern meadow. "That field could support warehouses." Audrey's expression cooled. "It supports 20 families. Sentiment is expensive. So is replacing loyalty once it has been sold." Everett heard the exchange from the far end of the glasshouse. Warren laughed, but the sound carried no amusement. Later, Audrey found Everett examining the furnace pipes. "You disapprove of him," she said. "My approval is irrelevant." "That is a careful answer." "Careful answers survive careless rooms." She studied him, then looked toward the rain silvering the glass. "Did careful answers serve your wife?" The question was bold enough to offend, yet her voice held no cruelty. Everett's hand stilled against the iron pipe. Few people mentioned Catherine. Fewer still dared suggest that courtesy had failed them both. "No," he said at last. Audrey did not apologize. She simply stood beside him in the damp warmth, allowing the silence to remain honest. "Then perhaps silence is not always dignity," she said. Everett turned toward her. A strand of dark hair had loosened near her temple, and there was soil on one glove. Nothing about her resembled the women who had once filled his drawing rooms, yet the space between them felt charged with something quieter than attraction and more dangerous than curiosity. Recognition. He stepped back first. "Your north furnace will not last the winter." "I know. I can send an engineer." "At county expense?" "At mine." Her gaze sharpened. "I cannot accept charity." "Then consider it an advance against the harbor assessment." She understood the compromise he had constructed for her pride, and something softened in her face. "You are very skilled at disguising kindness as accounting." Everett closed his notebook. "Kindness is more dependable when properly documented." For the first time, Audrey smiled at him. It was brief. It was small. Yet on the long road back to Alderwick, Everett realized he remembered its exact shape. The memory of Audrey's brief smile remained with Everett even after the wedding morning had shattered every careful distance between them, and now, as the tide sealed Alderwick Priory beneath a moonless sky, that memory felt like a relic from a life neither of them could return to. Audrey stood in the library beside the false ledgers, listening to rain sweep across the ancient windows while June slept upstairs under Mrs. Hollis's watch. She should have been exhausted. Instead, a single thought moved through her with relentless clarity. Her mother had known. Years before her death, Eleanor Bellamy had warned both daughters never to remove the stone basin beneath the oldest white camellia in the glasshouse. Audrey had believed it was sentiment, a grieving woman's attachment to the first flower she planted after June's birth. Now the instructions sounded different. Deliberate. "There may be papers at the farm," Audrey said. Everett looked up from the shipping record. "What kind of papers?" "I do not know." She explained the stone basin, her mother's warning, and the small iron key June had worn on a ribbon since childhood without knowing what it opened. Gideon advised waiting until morning, but Audrey shook her head. "Warren knows the wedding failed. By sunrise he may search the property." Everett studied the storm beyond the glass. "The upper road remains open for another hour. Then we have 1 hour." 20 minutes later, their carriage crossed the bridge before the rising tide swallowed its lower stones. Rain struck the roof in hard silver bursts, and neither spoke until Bellamy Farm appeared through the darkness, its glass house shining faintly beneath the lightning like a lantern abandoned in a field. The doors were unlocked. That frightened Audrey more than if they had been broken. Inside, the air smelled of wet earth, rosemary, and cold iron. Several planting tables had been disturbed. Drawers stood open. Papers lay scattered across the floor. Someone had already searched, but not carefully enough. Audrey led Everett to the northern wall, where the oldest camellia grew beneath a web of cracked panes. Together they moved the heavy stone basin aside. Beneath it, one floor tile carried a narrow keyhole. June's key turned with a soft click. Audrey lifted the tile and found a black iron box wrapped in oilcloth. Her fingers trembled as she opened it. Inside lay the original deed to the Eastern Meadow and Harbor Road, signed by her mother and witnessed 15 years earlier. The property had been placed in trust for Audrey and June. Silas had never possessed the legal right to pledge it. Beneath the deed rested shipping receipts bearing the Prescott seal, each tied to midnight deliveries never entered in the public harbor books. Everett's face changed as he read the dates. "These vessels belong to my father's company." Audrey looked at him. "Your father? He died after accusing an unnamed partner of using coastal routes for unlawful trade. His evidence disappeared." The final item was a sealed letter addressed to Everett himself, written in Eleanor Bellamy's hand. He opened it carefully. The letter warned that Prescott Coastal Transport had hidden shipments through Bellamy Harbor, and that Everett's father had discovered the arrangement shortly before his death. Eleanor had concealed copies because she feared Silas would surrender them under pressure. Audrey watched Everett read the last line twice. His composure remained intact, but one hand tightened around the page. "Your mother tried to protect both families," he said. "And my father buried the truth. We do not know that yet." Audrey looked at the disturbed tables and the open drawers. "Someone knows the box exists." A sound came from the far end of the glasshouse. Not footsteps. A door settling in the wind. Still, Everett moved closer, not touching her, only placing himself between Audrey and the darkness. She noticed. "I do not need to be shielded from every shadow." "No," he said quietly. "Only the ones that move." Then Audrey saw a fresh trail of mud leading from the rear entrance to the camellia bed. Whoever had searched the glasshouse had left only minutes before they arrived. The mud trail ended at the eastern door, where rain swept across the threshold and erased every mark beyond the glasshouse. Everett secured the iron box beneath his coat, while Audrey searched the dim rows of planting tables for anything else disturbed. One ledger was missing from the shelf beside the furnace. It contained the names of every family paid through Bellamy Harbor during the previous year. "Warren does not only fear the deed," she said. "He fears witnesses." Everett looked toward the dark fields. "Then we must reach them before he does." They returned to Alderwick Priory shortly before midnight, crossing the narrow bridge as seawater climbed over its lowest stones. Silas Bellamy was waiting in the entrance hall. Rain darkened his coat, and his face held the exhausted look of a man who had spent too long bargaining with consequences. June stood several feet away, wrapped in a wool shawl, refusing to sit. Audrey stopped beneath the empty stone niches. "Why are you here?" Silas looked at the iron box in Everett's hands. "Because I knew you would find it eventually." June's voice trembled. "You knew about Mother's papers?" "Not where she hid them." Audrey approached her father slowly. "Did you sign the harbor loans?" He closed his eyes. "The first one." "And the others?" "Warren copied my signature after I refused to continue." The confession settled over the hall like dust. Silas explained that the first loan had seemed legitimate, intended to repair the pier and preserve the winter contracts. Weeks later, he discovered the money had passed through Prescott accounts. When he threatened to expose the arrangement, Warren produced letters claiming June had been born before Silas and Eleanor were legally married. The accusation was false, but in Blackwater Reach, scandal often traveled faster than proof. Warren promised to destroy the letters only if Silas remained silent, and brought Audrey to the altar. June stared at him. "You believed him?" "I believed society would." Audrey felt her anger become colder. "So you protected one daughter by selling the other?" Silas flinched. "I told myself the marriage would save the farm. Warren promised you would keep the glasshouse. He promised what you needed to hear. I was afraid." "So was I." Her voice did not rise. That made the words heavier. "The difference is that you were willing to make your fear my future." Silas lowered his head. June turned away from him, pressing one hand against the stone wall as though the priory itself were steadier than blood. Everett remained near the door, silent until Silas reached toward Audrey. "Do not," Everett said. The command was quiet. Silas stopped. Audrey looked at Everett. "I can speak for myself." "I know." He stepped back at once, leaving the space to her. That restraint mattered more than protection would have. Silas removed a folded paper from his pocket. It was Warren's invitation to a public hearing at St. Orzin 2 days later. He intended to declare Audrey unstable, accuse Everett of interfering for personal gain, and demand that the marriage settlement be enforced by the county magistrate. "He will destroy you both," Silas whispered. Everett took the invitation and read it once. "No. He will gather every person we need into one room." "You cannot confront him openly," Audrey said. "Not yet." She looked toward the iron box, then at June. A plan formed with the calm precision of ice spreading over still water. Warren must believe I regret leaving the chapel. June turned sharply. Audrey, no. I will not marry him. Audrey faced her father. But you will return to Prescott House before dawn. You will tell him I am frightened, that the farm matters more than my pride, and that I wish to speak privately before the hearing. Silas stared at her. He will suspect a trap. Only if you sound courageous. Everett studied Audrey with an expression she could not fully read. You intend to make him produce the forged agreement. And the missing ledger. He will bring whatever he thinks can control me. It is dangerous. So is silence. For a moment, the entrance hall seemed to narrow around them, candlelight trembling against ancient stone. Everett wanted to forbid it. She could see that. Instead, he gave a single nod. Then we prepare every witness before he realizes the bride he tried to purchase has become the judge he cannot avoid. 2 days later, St. Orizon filled before the morning fog had lifted from Blackwater Reach. The same pews that had witnessed Audrey's refusal now held magistrates, landowners, merchants, and villagers drawn by rumor. Warren Prescott stood near the altar in a dark coat, composed beneath the fractured colors of the stained glass. Margaret sat behind him with her hands folded over a silver-headed cane, wearing the expression of a woman certain that rank could reshape truth. Audrey entered without a veil. Her gown was plain charcoal wool, and June walked beside her. Silas followed several steps behind, his face hollow with shame. Everett came last with Gideon Shaw and carried no visible papers. That was deliberate. Warren smiled when Audrey approached. I am pleased you have recovered your judgment. I have recovered more than that. The magistrate called the hearing to order. Warren presented the signed preliminary settlement, and declared that Audrey had accepted marriage in exchange for the payment of Bellamy debts. He described her departure as an emotional disturbance encouraged by Everett, whose purchase of the debt, he claimed, had been intended to gain control of Bellamy Harbor. Every word was polished. Every lie wore the clothing of reason. When he finished, Margaret leaned toward a neighboring widow and whispered loudly enough to be heard. A woman who abandons her vows should not be trusted with property. Audrey waited until the room became still. Then she placed the original deed upon the altar rail. The eastern meadow and harbor road were never my father's to pledge. They were placed in trust for June and me by our mother. Gideon handed copies to the magistrate. Warren's smile thinned. A forgotten deed does not erase lawful debt. No, Audrey said. But forged signatures do. Gideon opened the loan ledger and displayed the repeated curve beneath Silas Bellamy's name. Silas stepped forward. His voice shook, but it carried. I signed the first note. I did not sign the others. Warren looked at him with quiet contempt. A desperate man will say anything to save his estate. Then perhaps you will trust your own records, Everett said. Mr. Hollis opened the chapel doors. Wind swept through the aisle, bending the candles. One by one, the women of Bellamy Glasshouse Farm entered, followed by fishermen, dock clerks, and 2 former Prescott drivers. Mrs. Harlow carried the missing wage ledger against her chest. This was left at my cottage last night, she said. Mr. Prescott's clerk offered me money to burn it. The clerk, standing near the rear wall, lowered his eyes. Another witness described midnight shipments moved through Bellamy Harbor under false names. A driver produced copies of orders bearing Warren's seal. The magistrate examined each document, while the murmur in the pews changed from curiosity to alarm. Warren turned toward Audrey. You arranged this spectacle because I refused to indulge your pride. No, she replied. You arranged it when you invited the county to watch you accuse me. His composure cracked. You would believe laborers over a gentleman? Everett did not step in front of Audrey. He stood behind her, exactly where he had promised to stand, and his voice reached every corner of the chapel. Here the witnesses she had the courage to gather while men of rank remained silent. Audrey placed her mother's letter beside the deed. These records connect Prescott coastal transport to concealed shipments and false accounts extending back more than 15 years. Warren glanced toward the doors. The magistrate noticed. You will remain until this inquiry is concluded. Margaret rose abruptly. This family will not be judged by servants. June faced her. They are not servants here. They are witnesses. The words were soft, yet they silenced the chapel. Warren looked across the room for support, and found only lowered eyes. Even those who had whispered against Audrey now shifted away from him. The magistrate ordered the Prescott accounts seized for examination and suspended every claim against Bellamy Farm. Warren's public certainty vanished beneath the same gaze he had once intended to use against his bride. Audrey looked toward the altar. Her abandoned veil had been folded into a small wooden box and left beside the prayer books. She touched neither it nor Warren. She simply turned toward the people whose homes had nearly been taken with hers. For the second time, she walked down the center aisle. This time, no one whispered. By spring, the cliffs of Blackwater Reach no longer seemed to stand beneath the same sky. The fog still gathered over the harbor at dawn, and the sea still struck the rocks with its ancient patience, but Bellamy Farm had begun to breathe again. The magistrate's inquiry cleared every unlawful claim against the property, and the eastern meadow remained in trust for Audrey and June, exactly as their mother had intended. Prescott Coastal Transport was placed under examination, its false accounts exposed one careful page at a time. Warren left the county before the first summer roses opened, carrying neither sympathy nor the authority he had once mistaken for respect. Margaret followed soon after. Their names remained in conversation for several months, then faded, as cruel names often do when people are no longer afraid to speak the truth. Audrey did not celebrate their fall. She had learned that justice was not triumph. It was the quiet return of what should never have been taken. With Everett's support, though never under his control, Bellamy Harbor became a cooperative owned by the families who worked along its docks. The widows from the glasshouse held shares in every shipment of herbs and flowers. June took charge of the records, discovering an unexpected talent for numbers and an even greater talent for refusing foolish proposals from merchants twice her age. Silas remained at the farm, but not as its master. Forgiveness did not arrive simply because regret had. Audrey allowed him the dignity of useful work and the burden of rebuilding trust without promises. Some mornings they spoke. Other mornings they did not. Both were forms of honesty. At Alderwick Priory, the abandoned monastery garden changed as well. Audrey sent cuttings from her mother's white camellias, and Everett planted them along the old cloister walls with his own hands. The first blossoms appeared in late May, pale against the weathered stone. He showed them to no one until Audrey visited. They survived, she said, touching one petal with the tip of her glove. You sound surprised. This ground looked determined to reject them. Everett stood beside her beneath the silent bell tower. Some roots require patience before they believe they are safe. Audrey looked at him then, and the truth between them no longer needed disguise. He had never asked for gratitude. He had never used shelter as a chain. Through winter and spring, he had remained near without pressing closer than she allowed. Their affection grew in ledgers reviewed beside the fire, walks along the harbor road, and silences that no longer felt empty. On a quiet evening in June, Everett asked Audrey to accompany him to St. Orizon. The chapel was empty. Sunset shone through the stained glass, laying red and gold across the floor where she had once stood beneath the weight of every watching eye. On the altar rested a small wooden box. Inside lay the veil she had left behind. Audrey regarded it without fear. I thought it should belong to you, Everett said. Not as a memory of humiliation. As proof that you chose yourself when no one else had the courage to choose rightly. She closed the lid. I do not need proof anymore. No, he said. You do not. He faced her, his usual restraint softened by something deeper than uncertainty. I will not offer protection in exchange for obedience. I will not offer rank in exchange for gratitude. I can only offer the truth of what I feel and the freedom to refuse it. Audrey's breath caught, not because she feared the answer, but because for the first time in her life, no one had placed a price beside the question. Everett lowered himself to one knee. Audrey Bellamy, will you share your life with me? She looked around the chapel. There were no guests waiting to judge, no contracts hidden beneath flowers, no father turning away, and no man demanding that duty speak louder than her own heart. Only Everett. Only the evening light. Only choice. She held out her hand. Ask me again when you are standing beside me. He rose, and a rare smile changed his face. He asked again. Audrey answered yes. They married in the garden at Alderwick Priory beneath the first full bloom of the white camellias. June stood beside Audrey, Silas watched from a respectful distance, and the families of Blackwater Reach filled the old cloister with quiet laughter. Audrey wore no veil. She needed nothing between her face and the future she had chosen. When the restored bell rang above them, its voice traveled across the harbor, the glasshouse, and the dark sea beyond the cliffs. Everett took her hand, not to lead her, but to walk beside her. Love had not returned Audrey's dignity. It had waited until she reclaimed it herself, then entered gently, asking for nothing but the right to remain.